In the spring of 1844, in a plantation house on the outskirts of Richmond, Virginia, neighbors reported seeing unusual lights flickering in the pre-dawn hours. Smoke rose from the main house in patterns that defied explanation. By noon, the entire estate had gone silent. The Marquise Eleanor Whitmore, a widow of considerable wealth and influence, had vanished from public view. 6 enslaved people who worked her household disappeared from all records. No sale documents, no transfer papers, no death certificates. For 181 years, what happened in that basement remained buried beneath layers of aristocratic reputation and deliberate erasure, until a restoration crew broke through a false wall in 2025. Before continuing, subscribe and activate the notification bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. The discovery began with rot. Contractors hired to restore the Whitmore estate for its conversion into a historical museum noticed water damage in what they assumed was the foundation. When they removed wooden panels in the basement, they found something impossible: a sealed chamber, 12 feet by 12 feet, with walls covered in symbols that combined Christian iconography with West African spiritual markings. In the center, 6 iron shackles were still bolted to the floor, arranged in a perfect circle. And beneath decades of accumulated dust, investigators found something that would unravel everything the Whitmore family had built: dried blood, human hair, and fragments of cloth that carbon dating would confirm came from 1844. Eleanor Whitmore was no ordinary plantation mistress. Born into Richmond's elite in 1798, she inherited the estate at age 26 when her husband died, under circumstances that were never fully explained. Court documents from the period describe her as peculiar in temperament and given to strange devotions. Neighbors whispered about nighttime gatherings, about African spiritual practices she studied obsessively, about her belief that she could bind souls to her will through rituals passed down in secret. But Eleanor had power, wealth, and connections. The whispers never became accusations. The questions never became investigations. The 6 enslaved people: Samuel, age 34, Dinah, age 28, Joseph, age 26, Ruth, age 24, Benjamin, age 22, and Charity, age 19, worked in Eleanor's household. They were literate, which was rare and technically illegal. They were trusted with keys to rooms where other enslaved people never entered. And according to fragments found in Eleanor's personal correspondence, they were chosen. The letters, discovered in a hidden compartment behind the basement's false wall, describe a sacred covenant and a binding of essence that would grant Eleanor power over death itself. The language is cryptic, deliberate in its vagueness, but the intent becomes clear. Eleanor believed she could perform a ritual that would transfer the life force of these 6 people to herself, granting her extended years and supernatural influence. Chapter 1. The Marquise and Her Chosen Eleanor. Whitmore understood power in ways that terrified those who got too close. She had wealth, but wealth alone explained nothing. Women of her station managed households, attended church, and appeared in society within carefully defined boundaries. Eleanor shattered those boundaries systematically and with precision. She studied texts that respectable women never touched. She met with people that proper society avoided. And she recorded everything in journals written in a cipher that would take modern cryptographers months to decode. The journals reveal a woman obsessed with immortality and control. Page after page documents her research into what she called binding ceremonies, rituals she believed could link human souls to her own, creating vessels through which she could channel their strength, their years, their very essence. She wrote about West African spiritual practices learned from enslaved people who passed through her estate, about European occult traditions she acquired through correspondence with scholars in London and Paris, about Christian mysticism twisted into something darker. And she wrote about the 6 people she selected for what she called the Great Working. Samuel had been on the Whitmore estate since 1832. He could read Latin and Greek, taught secretly by Eleanor's late husband, who had progressive views that died with him. Dinah worked as a seamstress and had knowledge of medicinal herbs that Eleanor coveted. Joseph was a blacksmith whose strength Eleanor admired and wanted to possess. Ruth sang in ways that Eleanor described as channeling divine resonance. Benjamin kept accounts and understood numbers with an accuracy that Eleanor found useful. Charity was the youngest, brought to the estate specifically because Eleanor believed youth enhanced the ritual's potency. They knew something was wrong. Fragments of testimony preserved in an 1847 inquiry, initiated by a distant relative challenging Eleanor's will, mention that the six had tried to run. In February 1844, Samuel and Joseph were caught near the Appomattox River. They were returned, but the usual punishments never came. Instead, Eleanor increased their privileges. She gave them better quarters. She allowed them to eat food from her own kitchen. She spoke to them about transcendence and eternity and sacrifice for a greater purpose. The survivors who testified later said the six became quiet, withdrawn, as if they knew their fate but could not escape it. Eleanor's preparations were meticulous. The basement chamber was constructed in secret during the winter of 1843-44. Workers were brought from distant counties, paid in cash, and sent away before the work was complete. Eleanor herself painted the symbols on the walls, working alone at night. The shackles were forged by Joseph under Eleanor's instruction, a cruel irony that would haunt investigators centuries later. And Eleanor selected the date with astronomical precision. March 21, 1844, the spring equinox, when she believed the boundary between life and death grew thin enough to breach. In the weeks before the ritual, Eleanor wrote letters to associates that suggested she expected something transformative. She settled debts. She updated her will. She wrote to her sister in Charleston that she was on the verge of a great change and that their next meeting would reveal a woman remade. But she also made arrangements that suggested she understood the ritual might fail or have consequences she could not control. She instructed her estate manager to burn specific documents if she did not emerge from the basement by noon on March 22nd. She left sealed instructions with her lawyer to be opened only if she disappeared entirely. The night of March 20th, 1844, Eleanor brought the six down to the basement chamber. Neighbors later reported seeing lights that flickered between red and blue, smoke that rose in spirals, and sounds that might have been chanting or might have been screaming. By dawn, everything had gone silent. What happened in those hours remains partially unknowable. Eleanor's final journal entries were too damaged to fully reconstruct, but the physical evidence tells a story of ritual, restraint, and something that went catastrophically wrong. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. Chapter 2. The dawn of March 21, 1844. The ritual began at 4 in the morning, 3 hours before sunrise. Eleanor had calculated the exact moment when the equinox would occur, when day and night held equal power, when the old spiritualists believed rituals of transformation held their greatest potency. She wore white robes she had sewn herself, marked with symbols copied from grimoires she had acquired through decades of secret study. The six were brought down the narrow stairs one by one, wrists already bound with cloth to prevent marks that might raise questions later. Eleanor had thought of everything except the possibility that her victims might resist in ways she could not control. The chamber smelled of herbs and smoke. Eleanor had burned sage and sweetgrass mixed with something darker. Investigators in 2025 would identify traces of belladonna and mandrake root, substances known for inducing altered states and hallucinations. Candles placed at specific points created shadows that danced across walls covered in Eleanor's intricate paintings. The symbols combined Christian crosses with Adinkra symbols from West Africa, with Hebrew letters with astrological signs, creating a visual language that suggested Eleanor believed she was channeling multiple spiritual traditions into a single working. Samuel was placed first. Eleanor positioned him at the northern point of the circle she had drawn in what appeared to be ash mixed with crushed bone. The shackles closed around his ankles with a sound that echoed in the confined space. Dinah went to the east, Joseph to the south, Ruth to the west. Benjamin and Charity were positioned between them, completing the pattern. 6 points. 6 souls. Eleanor stood in the center, holding a ceremonial knife that had belonged to her grandmother, a woman also rumored to have practiced forbidden arts. What Eleanor believed would happen remains partially documented in the fragments of her final journals. She thought the ritual would create a sympathetic bond between her life force and theirs, allowing her to draw upon their years, their vitality, their essence. She had convinced herself this was not murder, but transformation, not destruction, but transcendence. The journals suggest she believed the 6 would enter a state of suspended existence, their consciousness preserved within her own, their experiences becoming her memories. It was a rationalization that allowed her to proceed with something she must have known was monstrous. The ritual involved chanting in languages Eleanor had taught herself, Latin prayers twisted into inversions, West African phrases she had learned from people she enslaved, words that may have been her own invention designed to sound ancient and powerful. She cut her own palm and pressed it to each prisoner's forehead, marking them with her blood in patterns that followed diagrams she had copied from occult texts. And she cut them, shallow wounds on forearms, enough to draw blood, but not enough to kill quickly. The blood flowed into channels she had carved into the stone floor, converging at the center where Eleanor stood. But Samuel spoke. Despite Eleanor's assumption that they would be passive vessels in her grand design, Samuel had words. He spoke in the language Eleanor had taught him, Latin phrases about judgment and damnation, about souls that could not be stolen, about justice that transcended earthly power. And something in his voice, witnesses later described it as carrying weight beyond mortal sound, seemed to shift the energy in that chamber. The candles guttered. The smoke changed direction. Eleanor's confidence wavered for the first time. What happened next cannot be reconstructed with certainty. The physical evidence suggests violence, chaos. Blood spilled far beyond what Eleanor's careful ritual required. Shackles were torn from walls with force that should have been impossible for people bound and wounded. Eleanor's blood mixed with theirs in patterns that did not follow her careful designs. And at some point between 4 and 6 in the morning, something catastrophic occurred. The limestone walls of the chamber cracked, several support beams in the basement split. And by dawn, 7 people had entered that chamber, but the fate of all 7 would remain unknown for 181 years. Chapter 3. The silence that followed. By noon on March 21, 1844, the Whitmore estate had transformed into something that defied explanation. The household staff who had not been selected for Eleanor's ritual found the main house empty. The basement door was sealed from inside, something that should have been impossible. Eleanor's bedroom showed signs of hurried preparation but no indication she had left. Her carriage remained in the stable. Her personal items lay untouched, and the 6 people she had taken into the basement the night before had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. The estate manager, a man named Thomas Caldwell who had served the Whitmore family for 20 years, found Eleanor's sealed instructions as she had directed. He read them alone in the library, and witnesses later said he emerged pale and shaking. He immediately ordered the basement door sealed with brick and mortar. He instructed the household staff never to speak of the previous night, and he sent urgent messages to Eleanor's lawyer and to certain influential families in Richmond who had connections to the Whitmore estate. What those messages contained was never recorded, but their effect was immediate and comprehensive. Within 3 days, an official story emerged. Eleanor Whitmore had departed on an extended journey to Europe for health reasons. She had taken several servants with her, their names carefully omitted from any documentation. The estate would be maintained in her absence under Caldwell's management. Her financial affairs would continue as normal. Questions were discouraged. Curiosity was met with legal threats from the Whitmore family lawyers who made it clear that speculation about Eleanor's whereabouts or activities would be prosecuted as defamation. The 6 who disappeared left families behind, partners, children, parents who had no legal standing to demand answers. An enslaved man named Isaac, who was Samuel's brother, tried to petition local authorities for information. His petition was denied and he was punished for the audacity of bringing it. A woman named Hannah, who had worked alongside Dinah for years, asked too many questions and found herself sold to a plantation in Mississippi within a week. The message was clear: accept the official silence or face consequences that could be fatal. But silence has cracks, and memory persists even when official history tries to erase it. The enslaved community on neighboring plantations began telling stories in hushed voices after dark. They spoke of lights in the Whitmore basement that still flickered on certain nights. They spoke of sounds, chanting, screaming, something that might have been laughter or might have been sobbing, that echoed from the sealed chamber. They spoke of Eleanor's ghost, sometimes seen in windows, sometimes heard walking halls, a figure that looked wrong, moved wrong, as if she had become something other than human. Thomas Caldwell managed the estate for 3 years after Eleanor's disappearance. In that time, he refused to allow anyone into the basement. He kept Eleanor's rooms exactly as she left them. He paid her bills and managed her investments as if she would return any day. But in July 1847, Caldwell was found dead in the library, an apparent suicide, though the circumstances were suspicious enough that a brief inquiry was opened. And it was during that inquiry that fragments of the truth began to surface. A distant relative of Eleanor's, seeking to claim the estate, hired investigators who questioned everyone who had worked at the Whitmore house in March 1844. Their testimonies were carefully hedged, filled with phrases like "I heard it said" and "some believed," but a pattern emerged. 6 people had been taken into the basement. Eleanor had been planning something she described as transformative. Unusual materials had been delivered to the estate in the weeks before, and on the morning of March 21st, something violent enough to crack stone walls had occurred in that sealed chamber. The inquiry went nowhere. The Whitmore family lawyers produced documents suggesting Eleanor was alive and traveling in Europe. They presented letters, later proven to be forgeries, supposedly written by Eleanor from London, Paris, Rome. They pressured the investigator to close the case, and eventually he complied. The official conclusion was that Thomas Caldwell had been unstable, that the missing enslaved people had run away, and that Eleanor Whitmore was alive but had chosen not to return to Virginia. The basement remained sealed, the questions remained unanswered, and officially, the case was closed. If this story has already captured you, leave a like. It helps the story of the 6 souls reach more people. Chapter 4. Buried Truths and Fractured Bones. For decades after 1847, the Whitmore estate existed in a strange, suspended state. Eleanor's family maintained it as if she might return, though as years became decades, this pretense grew increasingly absurd. The basement remained sealed behind brick that no one was permitted to touch. The house was occasionally rented to tenants who never stayed long. They reported disturbing sounds, shadows that moved against the light, a persistent smell of smoke, and something darker they could not identify. By 1900, the estate stood empty, slowly deteriorating into ruin. The enslaved community never forgot. Even after emancipation, even after the Civil War transformed Virginia's social landscape, descendants of those who worked neighboring plantations passed down stories about the Whitmore basement. They spoke of Eleanor's ritual, of the 6 who disappeared, of justice denied and truth buried. These stories were dismissed as folklore by white historians who wrote Richmond's official history. They were categorized as superstition, as the products of uneducated minds prone to exaggeration. The systematic erasure continued long after slavery itself had ended. In 1923, a historian named Robert Crawford attempted to research the Whitmore estate for a book about Richmond's antebellum architecture. He gained access to the house and tried to investigate the sealed basement. The Whitmore family, still nominally in control, though Eleanor herself would have been 125 years old, sent lawyers who threatened legal action if Crawford published anything about the basement or Eleanor's disappearance. Crawford capitulated, removing all references to the sealed chamber from his book. But in his private papers, discovered after his death in 1956, he wrote about what he had learned from elderly black residents who remembered stories passed down from their grandparents. "Something terrible happened in that house," Crawford wrote. "Something that Richmond's elite decided must remain hidden forever." The civil rights movement of the 1960s brought renewed interest in excavating hidden histories of slavery and violence. A group of activists and historians began documenting stories from black communities across Virginia, including accounts of the Whitmore estate. They collected oral histories from descendants who had never forgotten, who had preserved the names of the 6 disappeared: Samuel, Dinah, Joseph, Ruth, Benjamin, and Charity. These historians tried to get access to the estate to investigate the sealed basement, but the Whitmore family maintained their legal blockade. The house continued to decay, but the secrets it contained remained protected. By 1985, the last direct descendant of Eleanor Whitmore died without heirs. The estate entered legal limbo, claimed by distant relatives who had no attachment to Richmond and no interest in maintaining the property. The house fell into severe disrepair. Vandals broke windows. Weather damaged the roof. Trees grew through the foundation. But the basement remained sealed. The bricks that Thomas Caldwell had ordered placed in 1844 still holding after 140 years. Nature could breach the house, but human intention kept that chamber closed. In 2018, the Richmond Historical Preservation Society purchased the estate with plans to restore it as a museum, documenting antebellum architecture and slavery's legacy in Virginia. The project moved slowly, delayed by funding issues and debates about how to present the site's history. But in early 2025, restoration finally began in earnest. A crew of contractors started work on the foundation, expecting routine repairs. They discovered water damage in what should have been solid limestone walls. And when they began removing panels to assess the extent of the damage, they found the false wall that had been constructed behind Caldwell's brick seal. The chamber beyond should not have existed. Architectural plans from the 1820s showed no such space. But there it was, 12 by 12 feet, walls covered in symbols that made the construction foreman immediately stop work and call the project manager. The project manager called the Historical Society. The Historical Society called forensic archaeologists, and within hours, what had been a routine restoration became a criminal investigation spanning 181 years. The shackles told the first part of the story. 6 sets, arranged in a circle, still containing fragments of fabric and human hair. The blood-stained floor told another part, but it was what lay beneath the floor that transformed speculation into certainty. When investigators carefully excavated the chamber's foundation, they found bones. 6 sets of human remains, buried in shallow graves beneath the chamber floor. Carbon dating and forensic analysis would later confirm. These were the bodies of 6 people who died in March 1844, their ages and physical characteristics matching the historical descriptions of Samuel, Dinah, Joseph, Ruth, Benjamin, and Charity. Chapter 5. Evidence that could not be denied. The forensic excavation of the Whitmore basement chamber took 6 months. Archaeologists worked with extreme care, documenting every layer, photographing every artifact, treating the site as both a crime scene and a sacred burial ground. What they found painted a picture more disturbing than even the darkest oral histories had suggested. Eleanor's ritual had not been a quick death. The evidence showed prolonged suffering, restraint that left permanent marks on bone, and violence that spoke to ritual gone catastrophically wrong, or to a woman who had lost all capacity for mercy. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead forensic anthropologist, presented her findings at a press conference in August 2025 that made national news. The 6 individuals had all died between the ages of 19 and 34. Their bones showed signs of malnutrition and hard labor consistent with enslavement, but they also showed acute trauma consistent with the night of March 21, 1844. Wrist and ankle bones bore marks from shackles. Several individuals had defensive wounds on forearms. Most significantly, cut marks on bone indicated ritual cutting with a sharp blade, patterns that matched descriptions in Eleanor's journals of how the ritual should be performed. But the most disturbing finding involved Eleanor herself. Among the 6 sets of remains, investigators found a 7th partial skeleton. It was incomplete, missing the skull and several major bones, but DNA analysis and forensic reconstruction suggested it belonged to a woman in her 40s, consistent with Eleanor's age in 1844. The remains showed signs of extreme violence. Ribs were shattered, vertebrae were fractured, and the pattern of damage suggested she had been torn apart by multiple people working with desperate strength. The implications were staggering. Eleanor's ritual had failed, but not in the way she had feared. Instead of achieving transcendence, She had triggered a rebellion. The 6 people she had shackled and cut had somehow broken free. The torn wall brackets provided physical evidence of this. And in the confined chamber they had turned on the woman who had tried to steal their souls. The violence had been extreme, perhaps fueled by whatever substances Eleanor had burned, perhaps by pure desperate rage. They had killed her, and in doing so, they had sealed their own fate. Historical documents provided context for what happened next. Thomas Caldwell had entered the basement at dawn, likely responding to sounds from the chamber. What he found must have been horrific. Eleanor's body torn apart, the 6 dying or already dead from their wounds and from whatever substances Eleanor had used. Caldwell made a choice in that moment, a choice to protect the Whitmore family reputation, to prevent a scandal that would destroy one of Richmond's most prominent families, to bury the truth literally and metaphorically. Caldwell cleaned the chamber as best he could. He moved Eleanor's skull and major bones, likely burying them elsewhere on the estate. They have never been found. He left the 6 where they had fallen, burying them in shallow graves beneath the chamber floor. He sealed the room with brick and mortar, and he constructed the elaborate fiction of Eleanor's journey to Europe, using her money to forge letters and create a false trail. His suicide 3 years later may have been driven by guilt, by fear of discovery, or by something else. Witnesses reported that in his final months, he spoke of dreams in which the 6 appeared to him, accusing him of abandoning their memory. The discovery prompted immediate legal and ethical questions. The 6 individuals were murder victims, but their killer was also dead. They were the remains of enslaved people, requiring special protocols under federal nag-prey-like legislation. They were evidence in a historical crime, necessitating careful documentation. And they were human beings whose names and stories had been erased, demanding recognition and dignity in death that they had been denied in life. The Richmond Historical Preservation Society created a committee to determine appropriate next steps. Descendants of enslaved people from the Whitmore estate and neighboring plantations were located and consulted. Genealogical research confirmed several living descendants of Samuel and Dinah's families. These descendants were given primary say in how the 6 should be commemorated. After months of discussion, a decision was reached. The 6 would be given proper burial in a cemetery that accepted black burials in 1844, with full honors and a memorial that would tell their story completely. Chapter 6. Memory, Justice, and the Weight of History. On March 21, 2025, exactly 181 years after the ritual, Richmond held a ceremony that the city had never seen before. 6 caskets, each draped in cloth that combined traditional West African patterns with symbols of remembrance, were carried through streets that once hosted slave markets. Thousands attended, descendants of enslaved people, historians who had fought for decades to uncover truths like this, community members who understood that this was not just about 6 individuals, but about the thousands whose deaths under slavery had been erased or justified or forgotten. The Reverend Marquise Thompson, whose great-great-great-grandmother had worked a plantation neighboring the Whitmore estate, delivered the eulogy. He spoke their names: Samuel, Dinah, Joseph, Ruth, Benjamin, Charity. He spoke of Eleanor Whitmore not with hatred but with something more complex, acknowledgement that she was a product of a system that granted absolute power over other human beings, and that such power inevitably corrupted. He spoke of Thomas Caldwell's choice to protect reputation over truth, a choice that echoed through decades of historical erasure. But he also spoke of resistance. The evidence suggested that in their final moments the 6 had fought back. They had broken shackles that should have held them. They had turned on their tormentor. They had refused to be passive victims in Eleanor's grand design. They denied her even in death, Thompson said. They refused to give her the transcendence she sought. And in doing so, they claimed a victory that took 181 years to be recognized. The memorial built at their gravesite does not hide the complexity of their story. Designed by Maya Williams, a black sculptor from Richmond, it depicts 6 figures breaking free of chains, surrounding a 7th figure that represents Eleanor, not triumphant but broken and brought low. The inscription reads, "Here lie Samuel, Dinah, Joseph, Ruth, Benjamin, and Charity murdered March 21, 1844, by Eleanor Whitmore, in a ritual meant to steal their souls. They resisted. They remembered. We remember them. The discovery has prompted broader investigations into Richmond's hidden histories. Archives are being searched for other cases where enslaved people disappeared without record, where elite families might have buried crimes behind walls of money and influence. Basements in old plantation houses are being excavated with new attention to what might lie beneath. Oral histories from Black communities are being treated as valuable evidence rather than folklore. The work is painful, slow, and necessary. For living descendants, the discovery brought mixed emotions. Patricia Morrison, who traced her lineage to Samuel's sister, spoke at the burial ceremony about carrying a family story she had never fully believed. "My grandmother told me that Samuel disappeared, that the family was told he ran away, but that nobody believed it," Morrison said. "She told me they knew he was dead, that he died trying to protect others, but they had no proof. Now we have proof. Now we can say his name and know exactly what happened to him. It doesn't erase the pain, but it restores his dignity." The Whitmore estate will become a museum, but not the genteel architectural showcase originally planned. Instead, it will focus on Eleanor's crime and the 6 lives she took. The basement chamber has been preserved exactly as investigators found it, with shackles and symbols and bloodstains documented in painful detail. Visitors will read Eleanor's journals in their own words, understanding how an educated woman convinced herself that ritual murder was spiritual transcendence. They will see the evidence of resistance, the torn brackets and shattered bones that speak to desperate fighting in a confined space. And they will read about the 181 years of silence that followed, the deliberate choice to protect a killer's reputation over victim's memory. Eleanor Whitmore's remaining bones have not been given the ceremony accorded to her victims. After consultation with descendants and historians, the decision was made to cremate them and scatter the ashes without ceremony or marker. Some argued she deserved proper burial, that everyone does regardless of their crimes. Others argued that she had forfeited that right through her actions. The final decision reflected a compromise. She would be cremated and scattered, acknowledged but not honored, remembered but not memorialized. The case has sparked broader conversations about historical memory and justice. How many other crimes lie buried in plantation basements covered by walls or simply erased from documents? How many people disappeared into slavery's machinery without leaving even the fragments of evidence that Samuel, Dinah, Joseph, Ruth, Benjamin, and Charity left behind? The answer is thousands, perhaps tens of thousands. People whose names are lost but whose lives and deaths mattered just as much. Subscribe to this channel to discover more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of the Whitmore basement. We'll see you in the next video.